and we see in other places labor markets being very tight. And at the same time, we have two sources of demand of supply interruptions: the interruptions caused by COVID and those caused by the push-up of oil and gas prices. Now, in any case, when you have a slowdown of the economy, that would mean that also commodity prices would be impacted. And therefore, there would be, independent on whether the war goes on or not, we can see a positive impact on inflation by tightening up financial conditions. I do want to recognize that we need to very carefully study the inflation phenomenon in this new world we find ourselves today. Why? Because fragmentation in the world economy also means that we might see shifts in supply chains that impact cost structures on a more permanent basis. And that is not what monetary policy can address. But David, there is plenty monetary policy can and must address because of this mismatch between demand and supply that is also due to demand being still quite heated. I am convinced that if we do not restore price stability, we will undermine prospects for growth. We would create more uncertainty for investors, and we would put consumers in a very difficult spot. You all know inflation is a tax on the lower income parts of our society, and therefore cannot be allowed to fester for longer. But you do put an important question. We do need to look into what may be longer-term impacts of shifts in supply chains on overall level of price. And this is another reason why we're so keen to bring the world together and keep the world together, because if we lose the benefits of a more integrated global economy, we all would be poorer, and the impact would be felt most dramatically in emerging markets and developing countries.
Thank you, Kristalina. As usual, we'll try and do a tour of the world as quickly as we can, so keep it short if you can, please. Shabtai from DevEx, right here in the front row.
Thank you very much for taking my question. Given the outlook and all the risks that you've highlighted, and particularly the fight against inflation, which could cause some slowdowns, for emerging markets in particular, what's your prognosis for the most vulnerable, particularly if overseas aid is not increased and if the war in Ukraine carries on? Basically, how much more longer can these vulnerable countries hang on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me start with the most dramatic of shocks vulnerable countries are experiencing, and it is the food shock. We have identified 48 countries that are particularly severely impacted by food insecurity. You wouldn't be surprised that quite a large number of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, a region of the world that is most profoundly impacted by food insecurity at any time. We have been engaging with countries and mobilizing support not just from the fund, but from the international community, working together with the World Bank, with the World Food Programme, with the FAO, with the World Trade Organization, because we need not one set of measures, we need comprehensive set of measures to address this particular vulnerability. The second big vulnerability for these countries is debt, and there what we are appealing for is to make the common framework more attractive. We have now some modest success with Zambia and Chad, but we don't yet see other countries knocking on the door of the common framework. Why? Because the process is not very predictable. It's like you're entering a tunnel. You don't know where the other side of the tunnel is. Because the way we bring all creditors is lumpy. You have the official creditors on one side, then you have the private sector creditors. So we have to expeditiously draw lessons from Zambia and Chad, what has worked and how, and then apply it to countries to get that response to that insecurity, to that being not sustainable, to get response much more actively. And I do hope during the meetings there would be a huge attention paid, and rightly so, to this topic.
Thank you, Kristalina. Let me recognize Colby Smith, the Financial Times. Colby, can you raise your hand? Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this. Colby Smith with the Financial Times. In light of the vast uncertainty about the outlook and all the warnings about the global economy and financial stability risks, I'm wondering if you worry that the Fed risks breaking something perhaps by continuing with this very rapid 75 basis point pace, and if that's something it should reconsider. And second to that, if you are concerned that central banks are going to need to intervene, like the Bank of England, in order to shore up financial stability, even as they press ahead with interest rate increases.
To your first question, it was very telling and encouraging to listen to Secretary Yellen yesterday. She recognizes the potential impact of policies in the United States for the rest of the world. And that is also the position that the Fed chair, Jay Powell, is taking, that the Fed needs to be mindful of the impact it might have. This being said, we all recognize that central banks' mandate is price stability at home. And they have to pursue this mandate because think of the scenario in which inflation in the United States doesn't get under control for a long period of time. Bad for the US, but it also has spillover impacts for the rest of the world. How can the US be mindful of impact? Of course, first by communicating very clearly what are the intentions and forming these intentions in a thoughtful manner, as they have been doing. And second, the US has other instruments to support countries, and I think that they have been quite prudent. For example, the Fed is using swap lines very actively to help other countries, and the US has been very focused on food security, on supporting also us, the IMF, the World Bank, in providing, extending support to other countries. But I want to be clear, the reason we are endorsing a strong focus on inflation is because inflation has been quite stubborn, and the risk of inflation expectations de-anchoring has become more visible. We cannot possibly allow inflation to become a runaway train. Bad for growth and bad for people. Bad especially for poor people.
Thank you, Kristalina. Let's go to Africa. Simon, in the front here. Simon Ateba, Africa Today.
Yes. Thank you for taking my question. Glad to see you also, Gary, at your last press conference, and glad to see you, Ms. Georgieva, in person after 3 years, and especially after some people try to distract you and with a false story. But that's the past now. In recent days, you have repeatedly spoken about a darkening economic outlook and warned against a deepening food crisis in Africa, exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. I would like you to talk a little bit in details about the situation in sub-Saharan Africa. Where are we now? What specific policy recommendation do you have for Africa? And how should lenders and financial institutions, such as the IMF, respond? And how darkening is the overall situation in Africa? And if you can touch a little bit about the situation in the Horn of Africa, where we have the biggest humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking this question, because of all regions in the world, Africa finds itself in the most precarious position. Why? Because Africa was already affected by food insecurity due to climate events. We sometimes forget that the Horn of Africa and the Sahel were experiencing food insecurity, and for Somalia there was already concern that may become very dramatic before the war in Ukraine. We also know that Africa is unfortunately where we were as a global community a bit slow to provide the necessary vaccination support to fight COVID. And as a result, we have the scarring from COVID in many countries more severe. Just think what it means for children that are out of school for 2 years to then try to resume classes. Many drop out, especially girls, and that can have implications for quite some time. But there are positive stories we can tell. Many countries in Africa over the last decade have built strong fundamentals. They have worked very hard to increase their tax to GDP ratio, so they have the financial capacity to support their economies and their people. And now they are faced with the need of the international community to stand by them. So what is our advice to Africa? First, do stick to prudent macroeconomic policies. What we have seen in the COVID crisis, countries that had strong fundamentals, like people with strong immune systems, they withstood the shock much better than others. Second, for this moment in time, if you are seeing problems on the debt side, act early. And as I said, 60% of countries are in or near debt distress. Do not hesitate. Do not wait. Third, use the support system that the multilateral banks and the IMF is providing for you. And there we are mobilizing very firmly. I mentioned the food shock window, but we are also moving in many countries with upper credit tranche programs. I met with a number of presidents and finance ministers from Africa to say, let's work together to come out of this tough time with even stronger position. And above all, it is so important that Africa doesn't waver from the big policy decisions like the Continental Free Trade Agreement to implement them, because there is so much Africa can do for Africa just by making it, removing obstacles to growth on the basis of African integration. My mantra has always been, what is the strength of Africa? Young population. How can you make use of this strength? Invest in young people, invest in digital connectivity, invest in competitiveness for the future.
Thank you, Kristalina. Let's go to the Middle East. Lady in the front row.
Mina Al-Arabi, The National. The Middle East, of course, has a mixed picture, but you're speaking about the threat of runaway inflation, which we see in Lebanon. And it seems that hardly any monetary policy can deal with the devastating impact of inflation at 200% and more. And yet we worry about a vacuum in political power, and the IMF has been very clear on its conditions. My first question about Lebanon is, what can we do given the circumstances there, and how the IMF sees the threat of this political instability. But more importantly also, this week we've heard of the possibility of this deal between Lebanon and Israel, maritime borders, and possibly some light for the energy crisis and also the economic crisis. What impact can that have for Lebanon and the region? Thank you.
Thank you, and let's celebrate when there is something to celebrate, and this agreement is a reason to celebrate, but it would only materialize as a source of growth and opportunities for Lebanon if we are to have a clear commitment on a political level to work for the stability of Lebanon. And I would appeal to everybody who is in the high corridors of power in Lebanon to put your country, your people first. We have a staff level agreement. We cannot move. Why? Because the prior actions we have identified that are for the benefit of the Lebanese people are not yet met. There is still this paralysis. And it can only be resolved by the political leaders in Lebanon putting aside what divides them and getting to a point of serving the people of Lebanon who deserve no less.
Thank you, Kristalina. Let's turn to the UK. I see Larry Elliott. I see very many. Maybe we'll take two from the UK. Larry, you're up first.
Thank you. Larry Elliott of The Guardian. There are reports coming out of London that the Chancellor is planning to axe some of the measures that he announced on September the 23rd. Do you think that would help calm the financial markets and remove some of the financial stability risks that you talked about in your opening remarks?
So thanks, Larry. Let's take one more from the UK in the front row. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mark Stone from Sky News. You said in your opening remarks that a complex time requires steady hands on the policy levers. So my question simply is, do you think the British government's hands are steady?
Okay, and let's just take one more. Lady in the front. And then we're gone from the UK.
My question is really to reiterate, given what you said about policy missteps and poor communication, how concerned are you by the ongoing market turmoil driven by the UK government's actions? And do you think that the Prime Minister will have to reverse do you think the Prime Minister will have to reverse additional tax cuts to calm the markets down?
Let me start by sharing with you. I had a very constructive meeting with the Chancellor and the Governor of Bank of England, and we discussed the importance of policy coherence and communicating clearly so there can be in this jittery environment, there could be no reasons for more jitter. To those who are here from the UK, you have a country with strong institutions and strong traditions of transparent, evidence-based policy making. And it is the foundation of these institutions, of course, the Independent Bank of England, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the engagement of the Parliament, the public, you from the press, that gives the reputation of the UK of a country with a strength in economic policy making. Our message to everybody, not just to the UK, to everybody is, at this time, fiscal policy should not undermine monetary policy, because if it does it, then the task of monetary policy becomes only harder, and it translates into the necessity for even further increase of rates and tightening financial conditions. So don't prolong the pain. Make sure that actions are coherent and consistent. I do believe that it is correct to be led by evidence. So if the evidence is that there has to be a recalibration, it is right for governments to do so.
Thank you very much, Kristalina.
And the Bank of England, Larry, the Bank of England action was appropriate. There was a financial risk to financial stability. The Bank of England addressed it, notwithstanding the commitment it has to pursuing its main monetary policy objective, which is price stability.
Okay, thank you very much, Kristalina. Let's keep going around the world. Argentina, Rafael, please, in the front row.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and a warm farewell to you on your last annual meetings. Ms. Georgieva, good morning. Argentina has passed 2 reviews on its IMF program, but inflation has gone up, growth is going down, political risks remain very high, and the economy is still very fragile, according to the IMF staff. What do you think is the best case scenario Argentinians can hope for going forward with this program? And the IMF has been very accommodating to Argentina's requests. How flexible do you think the IMF is willing to be in order to keep this program afloat? Thanks.
Our commitment is to the people of Argentina. And what they expect is that their government will take to heart the need to bring inflation down, to provide a platform for growth to accelerate, and that is what we support with our program. We are fully mindful that not just in Argentina, in many countries, there is pressure from the public that goes in the opposite direction of what is best for people. Pressure to increase spending when it is not affordable, and when it fuels inflation. And what we are very pleased to see is that Minister Massa has taken his responsibility very seriously, and his commitment, his team, himself, to stick to what we have agreed in our program is demonstrably there, because we have been able to complete successfully the 2nd review. We will be very closely following how the economy responds to policy measures. We never take a program to be, set in stone if conditions significantly change. But I can tell you that we are not going to be flexible against the interests of the people of Argentina. We would be looking at the realities in Argentina, making sure that our program helps to anchor the economy, and over time bring the access to market back to life for Argentina. You're right to flag there are political factors. They exist in all countries. Obviously, we will be following very closely how they may be projecting over time and acting accordingly.
Thanks, Kristalina. Let's turn to Asia. I'm going to go to colleagues online just for a second. Gabriel Yin from CCTV, do you want to come in? Gabriel, then I'll go to Lalit Jha for India. So let's take those 2 questions. And Gabriel, can you come in?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Madam Managing Director. And Jerry, for the record, I was clapping with Managing Director and everyone else in the room for you. Thank you for all of your help and your work. And Managing Director, my question is on the sustainable transition or the environmental crisis that every country is facing right now. Given all of the challenges that you've listed, and most of those challenges are more immediate than the environmental challenge, how do you think, or how would you advise countries to still focus and invest on sustainable transition right now? Thank you.
Very good question. The risk, of course, is there this year, possibly next year, that we would see more reliance on fossil fuels because of the energy crisis that Russia's war in Ukraine has created. But I'm convinced that it would be, since we had our Argentine colleague before you, I would use an Argentine analog, it would be tango but played the right way. We make one step backwards and then two steps forwards. I am convinced that what is happening today would only accelerate the green transition, because energy security is now an added factor in considerations of what directions economies take.
Okay, thank you very much, Kristalina. Let's go to Lalija, India.
Thank you, Gary. We'll all miss you here. Madam Managing Director, I would like to ask you about India, which many of your colleagues in the IMF have described it as a bright spot in the current global scenario, and your expectations from India next year when it heads the G20 group. What India should do next year to lead this group?
India deserves to be called a bright spot on this otherwise darker horizon because it has been a fast-growing economy even during these difficult times. But most importantly, this growth is underpinned by structural reforms. Among them, the remarkable success in digitalization in India, from digital ID to providing all services and support on the basis of digital access. This has been indeed a huge factor for India's success. And the country is now stepping into taking the lead on G20 from that position of strength, which makes me strongly believe that we would see India leaving a mark on the world for years to come during next year's presidency. And what could that mark be? In what areas? It could be in the area of digitalization, including digital money. We know that we need regulation of crypto. We know that we need to get some more attention to cross-border payments, and how we are proposing public investment in the infrastructure of a cross-border payment platform. It can be in the area of bringing more fairness in our institutions. Next year, we need to complete the 16th quarter review. India has been a very strong voice for the fund to be financially strong and also to be a strong institution on the basis of fair representation of our members. It could be in renewable energy. What is not so well known, you know it, that India has really leapfrogged in terms of solar and other forms of renewable energy. So I very much look forward to next year, and I'm sure that it would make the people of India, the whole nearly 1.4 billion of them, very proud.
Thank you, Kristalina. I want to take a question from China on WebEx, Wire He from the Yikai Global, and we'll try and squeeze in just two quick ones. We're running a bit over. If you can make it very short, please. Wire He, please come in.
Thank you. So I had a question on the global economy. As Fed and other major central banks continue to push forward tightening policies and a possible currency crisis on the way, what is the probability of the global economy falling into recession next year? Thank you.
Christina, let us take one more.
Yep.
Eric Martin, Bloomberg.
Thank you very much, Managing Director. I wanted to ask you about the IMF's outstanding credit and lending across the board. From our calculation is at a new record this year. And I want to ask you about IMF resources. You just made reference to the quota review. How necessary is it to get that review done? Do you anticipate obstacles? And you know, we're in Washington, a city where everything always happens at the last minute. What expectation do you have or hope do you have to get it done prior to the December 2023 deadline? In other words, in the course or earlier next year, perhaps? Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And just
yes.
one more. Last question is going to come from AFP here in the front row. AFP? And we can make it short.
And there's somebody that is saying, me too, please,
I
this
know.
lady. Yeah,
Well,
one more.
Another press
Okay.
conference tomorrow.
Sorry. So Bei from the AFP. So G20 representatives are meeting today, and you have previously called for decisive action led by the group as the world faces multiple shocks. So we wanted to ask, with divisions within the G20 and a lack of consensus on Ukraine, are you worried that tensions could derail some of the progress on issues that were discussed this week, such as inflation and poverty? Thank you.
Sorry, Kristalina. This is it.
Okay. Probability of recession has gone up. We estimate that 2/3 of the world economy equivalent will experience 2 or more consecutive quarters of negative growth. And as I mentioned in my opening, we think that the risk of global recession is now 25%, so it is not negligible. But we still have in our hands instruments that can navigate through. It is a narrow path, but the path is there. And it is like, you know, climbing a mountain. If we hold hands, we follow each other's steps, we actually can get there. We can avoid a global recession. On the IMF resources, Eric, we still have slightly over $700 billion available to lend. You're absolutely right. Demand for fund financing has increased. This is very logical. When growth prospects go down, when recession risks go up, we do need to step into our countercyclical role proactively. And I do encourage our members not to hesitate. If you think that you need a buffer, we are here for you. And that particularly applies to the innocent bystanders. Countries with strong fundamentals hit by exogenous shocks, we have precautionary lending facilities for you. So we are far from being constrained. As you also know, we have come up with this innovation of on-lending SDRs. We are targeting 100 billion. This is additional to our lending capacity of 1 trillion. Should there be a need, we may appeal to our members to do even more. Now the average is around 20% of the SDRs strong economies received. France set up a good example, saying we are going to go to 30%. Let's see how the economy shapes up. Do we need to do more? You're right to say that usually these decisions are taken after a great deal of negotiations in the last moment. We have a deadline mid-December 2023. There is a possibility that we may see some acceleration. Why? Because of the complicated global economic environment. There may be desire to send a signal that the fund is there for the members. And since, as I mentioned in an answer to a question about India, since India is the next chair of the G20, they're very committed to a strong, quota-based, well-resourced IMF. We might see more engagement that comes under their leadership. But ultimately, it is the membership, And it is the whole of the membership, not just the G20, all 190 members we need on board.
Thank you so much, Kristalina, and thank you for giving us a few extra minutes. Thanks to all of you for your patience. Those of you who did not get to ask a question today, please come back tomorrow.
Here tomorrow, so.
Come back tomorrow. We have another press conference. We'll try to make sure those who did not get to ask a question get to recognize tomorrow. Thank you all. See you over the next few days. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
World Bank President Malpass will begin his press briefing momentarily. Please stand.